Hey, I know nobody cares about Eternals right now, but
No, this is an important conversation.
I thought you'd think so. Like, pretty amazing disability representation, right?
Okay, look. Big picture. Anytime we're seeing disability representation, we in the disability community feel an obligatory pressure to publicly cheer for it.
Because there's so little disability representation?
Yeah, so we cheer for some problematic representations because even that is at least something. And we don't want studios to stop trying if we're too critical because they feel like we're canceling them.
But because they're not hiring disabled writers, directors, producers to tell the stories from those lived experiences.
And oftentimes, the people telling the stories haven't done the hard work of dismantling their own ableism and subconscious biases. And even if they have, these disability representations can sometimes feel like a box checked.
And if the film doesn't perform very well at the box office...
It's the disability representation that's the easiest to blame.
So, Eternals.
Personally, I didn't find the overall story very well written, regardless of the disability representation. I mean, if you like the film, I'm not here to try to convince you otherwise. I'll just say that it wasn't my cup of tea. But I do want to talk about the two disabled main characters and how their representation is and is not equitable.
Two? Who was the...
I'll get to that. We'll start with Makkari.
Wait, which one was Makkari?
The Flash knockoff.
Right, the one that used sign language.
Now, I have Meniere's disease as well as auditory processing disorder, but I still can't speak from a place of lived experience for the deaf community. So, I spoke with my friend Meryl Evans, and she's a highly respected deaf advocate who is also an accessibility and disability consultant. And I wanted to share her thoughts with Makkari's deaf representation here.
Oh, cool.
Number one, Makkari is a total badass and has my favorite superpower of the Eternals group.
But if you're gonna have a superhero with a disability, you would hope they were written as a badass.
Right. So, no points there. And Meryl and I's first thought when we talked was that they basically made the superhero with the obvious disability be the character with the least screen time.
Yeah, least amount of screen time and fewest lines.
Yeah, it felt like production might have been trying to make it easier for themselves, or maybe the audience who doesn't like to read, by giving her the least amount of lines. And who knows if that was a conscious choice or not, but if I were writing that character, I would write it so Makkari never shut up. Like, she's a speedster, so it fits that she'd talk all the time.
That's good.
But a bigger issue for me than the screen time and the lack of dialogue is that Makkari is a two-dimensional character. Like, apart from her superpower, her sole purpose in the narrative is to serve as the love interest for a male.
Ooh, right. I see that now.
And that's a women's representation issue, which is surprising considering who wrote it.
Yeah.
But there was one other big issue Meryl and I struggled with.
Which is?
It's probably better if I show you.
Mimasha Datua, Iltina Patani, Mimulu Halikani, Lashahat Shiran, La Tarak, and Pishnam Shaka Pakun.
I'm confused.
Right? They did the typical supercrypt trope where their superpower nullifies their disability, so their disability isn't disabling or as disabling.
No, I'm confused. Can she actually understand what people are saying by feeling the vibrations, or...
I'm right there with you.
So she's technically deaf, but does she have this superpower of hearing in a different...
She's the deaf equivalent of Daredevil, maybe?
But why? She doesn't need the ability to sense vibrations. She can just be deaf and fast and have more depth.
Kind of defeats the whole purpose of disability representation when you have a superpower that compensates for the disability. She actually doesn't represent a disability that exists in the real world with this vibration sensing ability.
Oh!
What?
She's a representation of what differently abled actually looks like.
Yes!
So, how would you rate this representation?
Okay, on a harm scale, it doesn't do too much harm other than not having people with those lived experiences and various levels of decision-making positions on the film, the on-screen representation is just disappointing. So maybe a harm scale of 1 for screen representation, with 10 being very harmful. Yeah.
And on a helpful, equitable scale?
Okay, so there's some good stuff here. Like, Google searches for learn sign language for beginners increased by 250% directly after this film's release.
Oh, wow. So that's good.
Yeah, so there's some real positives that came out of Makkari's representation, too.
Imagine the impact a truly equitable representation would have had. But who is the other disabled character you mentioned?
You're going to have to follow for the next video on them.